Have you ever stopped to think that perhaps some of your most important relationships aren't as pure as you believe? There's a moment, almost imperceptible, when something changes. It's not a fight, it's not a clear distancing, it's a strange feeling, as if there's a silent weight that wasn't there before. You're still there, present, involved, but something inside you starts to question, why is this happening? From an early age, you were taught to believe that true relationships are selfless. Love is about giving. Friendship is unconditional support. Loyalty is about permanence regardless of what happens. This idea is comfortable. It organizes the world in a simple and predictable way. But the problem is that it doesn't explain the whole reality. Because in practice, every relationship involves exchange. It may not be an explicit exchange. No one sits down to negotiate what will be given and what will be received. But still, something circulates between two people all the time. Attention, time, validation, recognition, presence. These elements don't appear out of nowhere. They are offered, received, and often expected. And here comes the first question that almost no one asks honestly. When you dedicate yourself to someone, is there or isn't there an expectation of return? Even if it's minimal, even if it's unconscious, it's there. You might say you don't expect anything, but observe your reactions. When you offer support and don't receive the same when you need it, something bothers you. When you make an effort to stay in touch and the other person doesn't show the same interest, something weighs on you. This discomfort doesn't arise from emptiness. It reveals that an exchange is happening even if you haven't recognized it before. The central point is not to judge this as right or wrong. The point is to understand that it exists. And when you ignore that reality, you begin to operate within an illusion. This illusion is dangerous because it prevents you from noticing subtle changes. At the beginning of a relationship, everything seems balanced. There is reciprocity, mutual interest, shared energy. You feel you are on the same level as the other person. But over time, this balance can begin to shift. Not abruptly, but gradually. You start to adapt more. You start to compromise more. You start to invest more time, more attention, more energy. And at the same time, the other person may not keep up with that pace. But that's not said. It's not discussed. It remains implicit. And that's exactly what makes everything more complex. Because when something is not named, it cannot be adjusted. You keep giving without realizing how much you're giving. You keep waiting without admitting that you're waiting. And this combination creates a silent accumulation. Small frustrations that go unexpressed. Small annoyances that are ignored. Small imbalances that become large over time. Now think carefully. How many times have you felt more present in a relationship than the other person? How many times have you felt like you were putting in more effort? And how many times have you simply accepted it without questioning it? Why did you accept? Perhaps because admitting there's an exchange seems to diminish the value of the relationship. Perhaps because you're afraid of seeming calculating. Or perhaps because you truly believe relationships shouldn't be measured that way. But ignoring it doesn't eliminate what's happening. It only makes you less aware. And when you're not conscious, you lose the ability to perceive when something is out of balance. There's a critical moment in many relationships, a point where one person starts giving more than they receive. This moment is rarely clear. It doesn't come with a warning. It builds up little by little. Through small, almost invisible decisions, you respond faster. You adapt better. You understand more. You are more willing to compromise. And gradually, this becomes the norm. The problem is that standards create expectations, and unrecognized expectations create frustration. You start to feel like you're being drained, but you don't know exactly why. You start to feel like something is unfair, but you can't explain it. And then a dangerous feeling arises. The feeling that you're being used. But here's an important twist, and what if at some level you also participated in building that standard? And perhaps it was their own willingness to give, without recognizing the value of what they were giving, that created this imbalance. This doesn't mean the responsibility is solely yours, but it does mean you're not just a spectator. You're in on the action. And that changes everything. Because from that point on, you need to confront something that might be uncomfortable. What exactly are you offering in your relationships? Not just in a superficial sense, but in a real sense. You offer listening, you offer support, you offer presence, you offer validation, and all of that has value, but you recognize that value. Or you act like it doesn't matter, because when you don't recognize the value of what you offer, you also don't realize when that value is no longer reciprocated. And that's how many people get into unbalanced relationships without realizing it. They don't know what they're giving away, therefore they don't know what they should be receiving. Now there is an even deeper question. Why would you enter a relationship offering something you don't know how to measure? And the answer may not be simple. You might be searching for something, even if you won't admit it. It could be acceptance. It could be belonging. It could be the feeling of being important to someone. It could be an attempt to fill a void that you don't fully understand. And the other one is doing the same thing. Two people, each with their own needs, trying to find something in each other. That's not wrong. But it becomes a problem when it happens unconsciously. Because when you don't know what you're looking for, you accept anything that comes close to it. And when you accept anything, you don't realize when you're getting less than you need. Now stop and observe your closest relationships with a different perspective, without romanticizing it, without justification. Just observe. Is there real balance, or is it just a feeling of balance? Is it a conscious exchange or just a habit? Is it genuine presence or just convenience? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, if you stopped offering exactly what you offer today, these relationships would continue to exist in the same way. If the answer isn't a clear yes, then there's something you're not seeing yet. And that's no small problem, because what you don't see influences you without resistance. What you don't recognize controls you. And that's precisely why this idea of purely selfless relationships can be so dangerous. Not because it's entirely false, but because it hides an essential part of reality. A part that, when ignored, creates space for imbalances, frustrations, and repetitive patterns. But when it starts to be noticed, everything changes. And the next question is no longer whether there is an exchange. The next question is to understand exactly what is being exchanged. Something is being exchanged in all your relationships right now, even in the ones you consider most sincere. And the most unsettling thing isn't the fact that there's an exchange. It's that most of the time you have no idea what's really at stake. You believe you offer simple things: time, attention, support. It seems basic, almost automatic, but in practice, each of these elements carries a much greater value than you usually realize. Time isn't just time, it's priority. Attention isn't just listening, it's validation. Support isn't just presence, it's emotional investment. And when you start looking at it that way, something changes. Consider a common situation. A friend who always comes to you when they're feeling down. They confide in you, you listen, offer advice, and get involved. In many cases, you become that person's emotional anchor. Now observe the other side. When you need them, that same person is available with the same intensity, or their presence diminishes. At first, you don't question it. You understand. You justify it. You say that everyone has their own way. But over time, something starts to bother you. Not because you've stopped liking the person, but because there's a clear difference between what you offer and what you receive. That's the hidden value. You weren't just listening. You were emotionally sustaining that relationship. Now consider a different context. A romantic relationship. In the beginning, everything seems balanced. Frequent messages, mutual interest, constant attention. But little by little, the person starts to dedicate more time. You respond faster, adapt more, worry more. The other person, noticing this, relaxes. Not necessarily out of malice, but because the dynamic allows it. Without realizing it, one ends up investing more energy than the other. And here's where something important happens. The more you invest without a proportional return, the more you increase the value the other person receives. And the more the other person receives without having to make an effort, the less incentive they have to balance the exchange. This creates a cycle. You give more hoping for balance. The other person gets used to receiving, and the imbalance grows. Now consider a professional environment. A coworker who always helps everyone, solves problems, covers for mistakes, anticipates needs. Initially, he is valued, recognized, but over time his behavior changes. People begin to rely on him as the standard. The help ceases to be seen as something extra and becomes expected. And what happens when he stops? He is being questioned. This reveals something essential. The value you offer is not just perceived, it is absorbed by the environment. And once absorbed, it becomes treated as part of the structure. The problem isn't in helping, the problem is in not realizing how much of this is being incorporated without equivalent return. Now there is an even deeper point. Not everything you receive in return is visible. Often what sustains a relationship isn't what's said, but what's felt. A sense of importance, of belonging, of usefulness. You might be in a relationship where you receive little in concrete terms, but you stay because you feel needed by the other person. This is more common than it seems. People stay in relationships where they give a lot and receive little because there is a hidden emotional reward. The feeling of being indispensable. But this raises a difficult question. Are you being valued or are you simply being needed? There is a clear difference. Being valued means that your presence is recognized, respected, and reciprocated. Being needed means that your role within the relationship is useful to the other person, regardless of whether you are cared for or not. And often, these two things are confused. Another everyday example. A person who always organizes meetings, keeps the group together, resolves conflicts. They are seen as essential. Without them, things don't work. But when this person is absent, you make an effort to maintain a connection with them. Was she important or merely functional? These questions are unsettling because they reveal something we prefer to ignore. The value that circulates in relationships is not always balanced, and it is not always conscious. Now consider something even more subtle. You also assess the value of people, even if you don't admit it. You gravitate towards those who make you feel good. You distance yourself from those who cause discomfort. You invest more in those who respond. You reduce your investment when there's no return. This happens automatically. In other words, you also participate in the logic of exchange. That doesn't make you manipulative. It makes you human. But when you ignore that, you lose the ability to understand why certain relationships work and others don't. There is a silent structure at work, a kind of invisible balance that determines how much each person invests and how much they receive. When this balance is maintained, the relationship flows. When it breaks down, tensions arise. And the most dangerous thing is that this break is rarely declared. It is felt. One responds less. Another tries harder. One distances themselves. Another tries to compensate. And so the dynamic adjusts in a disorganized way. Now think about how many times you've tried to fix a relationship by giving even more attention, more understanding, more presence. In their logic, that should solve it, but often it gets worse, because you further increase the value that the other person receives without demanding balance. And this deepens the pattern. Then a critical moment arises. You start to realize that something doesn't add up. You give too much, he receives little pay, and he doesn't understand why. The answer doesn't lie solely in the other person's behavior. It's in the structure of the exchange that was built. And this leads to an uncomfortable conclusion. Not all relationships are sustained by feelings. Many are sustained by the values that circulate between people. When this value ceases to be attractive to one of the parties, the relationship changes. It can weaken, it can transform, or it can end. And this happens even when affection still exists. Now there's a question you can't avoid. What exactly are people getting from you? And more importantly, what are you getting from them? If you can't answer that clearly, then there's a good chance you're in a situation you don't fully understand. And when you don't understand the dynamics, you don't control your decisions. You react, you insist, you adapt, but he doesn't choose consciously. And this opens up space for something even deeper, something that is not just in the visible exchange, but in its origin. Because the next layer isn't about what you offer or receive, it's about why you accept certain exchanges without questioning them. There's a silent moment when a relationship begins to unbalance, and almost no one notices when it happens. It's not at the beginning, when everything seems intense and reciprocal. It's not at the end, when the wear and tear is already evident. It's in the middle, in a phase where everything still seems to work, but small differences begin to emerge. You respond faster. The other person takes longer. You adapt to schedules. The other person keeps to their own. You show constant interest. The other person alternates between presence and absence. None of these things in isolation seems like a problem, but together they begin to form a pattern. And patterns, when ignored, become structures. The most dangerous thing is that this type of imbalance doesn't generate an immediate warning. On the contrary, it settles in comfortably. You rationalize it. You say it's a phase, that it's normal, that each person has their own rhythm. And so, without realizing it, you begin to occupy a different role within the relationship. You end up supporting more. Now stop for a moment and observe objectively. In how many relationships have you unknowingly taken on more emotional responsibility than the other person? How many times have you been the one who kept the conversation alive, who resolved conflicts, who prevented estrangement, who compromised to preserve the connection? And more importantly, in how many of those situations did the other person do the same for you with the same intensity? The imbalance doesn't begin when someone decides to give less. It begins when someone gets used to giving more, and that completely changes the dynamic. When you become the one who invests more, you also become the one who most depends on the continuation of that relationship. Because the more you invest, the more you need it to make sense. Otherwise, you have to face the fact that you gave more than you received, and that's hard to accept. So you continue. Keep giving, keep adjusting, keep trying to balance something that structurally has already gone off kilter. But there's a question that interrupts this cycle. and almost no one has the courage to ask it. If you stop sustaining this relationship today, what happens to it? She remains, or she simply starts to disappear. This response reveals more than any explicit behavior, because balanced relationships don't depend on just one side to exist. Now there's an even deeper detail. The imbalance is rarely noticed by those who receive more, not because the person is necessarily indifferent, but because their experience is different. For the one who receives more, the relationship seems comfortable, light, functional. For the one who gives more, it starts to feel burdensome. This creates a distortion of perception. One believes everything is fine, the other senses that something is wrong but can't explain why. And when he tries to explain, he is often not understood. Because the problem was never stated, it was built in silence. You start to feel like you're being drained, but you don't know exactly when it started. And when you try to adjust, there's already a history accumulated. Small concessions that have become the norm. Small absences that have been accepted. And here's where something even more complex happens. You start negotiating with yourself. You say it's not that important, that you can let it go, that it's not worth creating conflict. And little by little, you distance yourself from your own perception in order to keep the relationship functioning. But at what cost? How many times have you ignored an inconvenience just to avoid losing someone? How many times have you accepted less than you needed to avoid a breakup? And how many times has that actually solved anything in the long run? Imbalance has an inevitable characteristic. It doesn't correct itself. They are intensifying. The longer he goes unacknowledged, the more he becomes part of the relationship structure. And when something becomes structural, changing it requires confrontation. And confrontation is frightening, because when you confront someone, you run the risk of losing. But there's something few people consider. When you don't confront, you also lose. But you lose little by little, silently, without realizing how much you're giving up. Now think of something even more uncomfortable. And what if the other person isn't acting wrongly? What if he's simply responding to the dynamic that has been created? If you've always been available, always given in, always supported him, why would he change? This question changes the way you see the situation, because it shifts the focus away from blame and places the focus on structure. The relationship isn't unbalanced just because of one person. It's that way because the dynamics allowed it. And this leads to an essential point. You don't control the other person's behavior, but you directly influence the pattern of the relationship through what you accept, offer, and maintain. Now a major disruption occurs. If you started adjusting what you offered, the relationship would either reorganize itself or collapse. This answer defines everything, because relationships that depend on excess to function are not sustainable. They are dependent, and dependence is not connection. But there is an even deeper factor that explains why you enter and remain in this type of dynamic. It's not just about the other person, it's about you, regarding what you tolerate, regarding what you consider acceptable, based on what you believe you deserve. And these answers aren't built within the current relationship. They come from much earlier, from past experiences, of repeated patterns, needs that you haven't fully understood yet. Now observe this carefully. Why do you stay in a relationship where you have to give more than you receive? It's the fear of losing. It's a habit, it's attachment, or there's something deeper that you haven't yet identified, because as long as that answer remains unclear, the pattern tends to repeat itself in different people, in different contexts, with the same structure. And this reveals something you might not want to admit. The problem isn't just the relationships you choose. It's in how you position yourself within them. And as long as that doesn't change, the result doesn't change either. Now there is one last question that prepares the way for the next level of this understanding. What if the imbalance wasn't just a matter of behavior? What if it were the result of something you don't yet see within yourself? Something that influences your choices, your expectations, and even the type of relationship you are willing to maintain. There's a reason why you repeat certain patterns in relationships, even when you promise yourself that this time will be different. It's not a lack of intelligence, it's not a lack of experience. It's something deeper, something that operates outside your conscious field and silently influences your choices. Carl Jung called this the shadow. The shadow is not just an abstract concept. It represents everything you don't recognize in yourself. Desires you repress, insecurities you avoid facing, needs you try to hide even from yourself. And most importantly, all of this doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It remains active, shaping your behavior. Now think about something simple. Why are you attracted to certain people and not others? Why do some connections seem intense from the start, even without a logical explanation? This is rarely random. Often you are responding to something you don't clearly see. Research in psychology shows that people tend to connect with those who activate familiar emotional patterns, even when those patterns are negative. A widely cited study on attachment indicates that individuals with a history of unstable relationships are more likely to engage again in relationships with similar dynamics. Not because they want to suffer, but because the brain recognizes it as familiar, and what is familiar seems safe, even when it is not healthy. Now imagine a person who, from a young age, learned that they need to strive to be valued. They grow up believing that love needs to be earned, that attention needs to be deserved, that presence needs to be guaranteed through constant effort. When they enter a relationship, this logic continues. She gives more, it adapts better. Keep trying. And without realizing it, it creates exactly the kind of dynamic that reinforces that belief. Now consider another example. Someone who, through past experiences, has learned to protect themselves emotionally. They avoid exposure, avoid dependence, and maintain distance. When they enter a relationship, they may seem balanced at first, but over time they begin to withdraw, reduce intensity, and avoid deep involvement. This person is not necessarily uninterested. She is protecting something that she doesn't always understand. Now put these two people in the same relationship, one that constantly seeks validation. Another way to avoid deep involvement. What happens? One gives more, the other retreats. One approaches, the other moves away. And so a cycle is created that seems impossible to break. But this cycle didn't appear out of nowhere. It was built according to internal patterns that neither person fully recognizes. That's the key point. Many relationships are not just about two people interacting in the present. They are the meeting of unresolved histories, unacknowledged needs, and repeated emotional patterns. Now there is data that clearly reinforces this. Studies on pattern repetition show that a large percentage of people tend to choose partners with emotional characteristics similar to those of previous relationships, even when those experiences were negative. This happens because the brain seeks consistency, not necessarily well-being. It prefers what is familiar to what is healthy. This explains why some people leave a difficult relationship and shortly afterwards enter another with a similar dynamic. It's no coincidence. It's standard, and this pattern is fueled by the shadow. Now think of something even more straightforward. How many times have you caught yourself saying you didn't want to repeat a situation, but ended up doing exactly that? How many times have you noticed a behavior that is harming you, but you continued it anyway? And how many times have you been unable to explain why you did it? These answers lie less in what you know and more in what you don't see. The shadow doesn't manifest itself in obvious ways. It appears in choices that seem natural, in decisions you don't question, in automatic reactions that you justify later. And in relationships, it gains even more strength, because the other acts as a mirror, but not an ordinary mirror. It reflects not only what you are aware of, but also what you avoid facing. You might get annoyed by someone who shows insecurity, but perhaps there's a part of you that feels the same way, and you're rejecting it. You might get frustrated by someone who withdraws, but perhaps there's a fear of dependence within you that you won't admit. And so, you react to the other person without realizing that you are, in fact, reacting to parts of yourself. This makes the relationships intense, confused, and often difficult to sustain. Now there's a point that completely changes how we look at all of this. The problem isn't having a shadow. Everyone has one. The problem is not recognizing it, because what you don't recognize, you project. And when you're designing, you lose the ability to separate what belongs to others from what belongs to you. Now imagine how this affects the exchange dynamics that you've already begun to notice. If you don't understand your own needs, you don't know what you're looking for in a relationship. If you don't know what you're looking for, you'll accept anything that comes close. If you accept anything, you don't realize when you're receiving less than you need. And that keeps you trapped in cycles. Cycles that appear different on the surface, but follow the same structure underneath. Now an inevitable question arises. What if many of your relationships weren't defined solely by other people's behavior, but it's about how you relate to what you don't yet understand within yourself? This question is uncomfortable, but it is necessary because it changes the focus. It takes you out of the position of someone who only reacts to what they receive, and it puts you in the position of someone who actively participates in constructing their own relational reality. Now there is one final detail that needs to be understood. Recognizing the shadow doesn't mean eliminating conflicts, it means seeing more clearly. It means understanding why you engage with certain people, why you accept certain dynamics, why you repeat certain patterns, and from that, have the possibility to choose differently. But this choice comes at a cost, because it requires you to let go of some illusions. It requires you to confront parts of yourself that you might prefer to ignore, and not everyone is willing to do that. But those who do begin to notice something that was previously invisible. Many relationships are not sustained solely by what is said or demonstrated. They are supported by internal structures that operate silently. And as long as these structures are not understood, the external dynamics tend to repeat themselves. Now, the issue is no longer just about understanding the other person, and then it becomes a matter of understanding what within yourself is shaping all of this. There's a reason why you enter certain relationships, and even when you notice signs of strain, you continue. It's not a lack of logic. It's not a lack of warning. It's something deeper, acting even before you become aware of your choice. Jung called this the shadow, and understanding this concept completely changes how you view your connections. The shadow represents everything you don't recognize in yourself, not just negative aspects, but also needs, desires, and vulnerabilities that you've learned to hide. In many cases, you don't ignore these parts by conscious choice. You simply never learned how to deal with them. So they remain there, operating in the background, and it is precisely at this point that relationships become a field of projection. You don't just connect with who the other person is, you connect with what the other person activates in you. This explains why some people seem intense from the start, even without a clear reason. It's not about them. It's about what they awaken in parts of you that were dormant or repressed. Research in the field of attachment psychology shows that emotional patterns formed in childhood directly influence how adults relate to others. People who grew up in environments where affection was unstable tend to seek relationships with the same dynamic, not because they like it, but because the brain associates familiarity with security. Now think about the impact of that. You may be seeking stability, but you're drawn to instability. You may crave reciprocity, but you get involved with those who offer little. You may desire presence, but you connect with those who distance themselves. And that's not inconsistent, it's standard. Consider a simple example. A person who has learned that they need to work hard to be valued. From an early age, they understand that attention doesn't come naturally, that recognition needs to be earned. When they enter a relationship, they bring this logic with them. She dedicates herself more. It adapts better, tolerate more. And without realizing it, it creates a dynamic where the other person ends up receiving more than they give. Now observe another profile. Someone who has learned that emotional exposure can cause pain. This person develops a tendency to keep their distance, to avoid deep involvement, to withdraw when the relationship begins to demand more presence. When these two people meet, the outcome seems almost inevitable. One tries to approach, the other one moves away. One increases the investment, the other one reduces, and so a self-perpetuating cycle is formed. But here's the point that changes everything. This cycle is not created solely by the interaction between two people. It is sustained by internal patterns that each one carries. Now here's a relevant piece of data. Studies on pattern repetition show that most people tend to choose partners with emotional characteristics similar to those of previous relationships, even when those experiences were negative. This happens because the brain prioritizes consistency. It seeks what it already knows, not necessarily what is better. This means that often you don't choose based on what you need. You choose based on what you recognize, and what you recognize isn't always healthy. Now think about how many times you've noticed a pattern repeating itself in your life. Different people, different contexts, but similar feelings, frustration, unequal effort, lack of reciprocity. This is no coincidence. It's repetition, and repetition is a clear sign that there is something unresolved. Now a direct question arises. What within you is being repeated through these relationships? This question is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Because while you focus only on the other person's behavior, you miss the chance to understand the origin of the pattern. And without understanding the origin, you just change the characters, but keep the same story. There is also an even more subtle aspect to shadow. It manifests itself not only in the choices you make, but also in the reactions you have. You might get annoyed with someone who seems dependent, but perhaps there's a part of you that also wants support, and you're not accepting it. You might get frustrated with someone distant, but perhaps there's a fear within you of becoming deeply involved, and so you react to the other person without realizing that you are dealing with something internal. This creates conflicts that appear external, but originate internally. Now observe how this connects to imbalances in relationships. If you don't understand your own needs, you don't know what you're looking for. If you don't know what you're looking for, you'll accept anything that comes close. And when you accept anything, you don't realize when you're getting less than you need. This keeps you stuck in dynamics that seem different, but follow the same logic. Another important point is that the shadow also influences the value you believe you deserve. If, on some level, you believe you need to make an effort to be accepted, you tend to accept relationships where you have to give more. If you believe you can't depend on anyone, you tend to withdraw when someone gets too close. These beliefs are not always conscious, but they are extremely influential. Now imagine what a relationship would be like where two people don't recognize these parts of themselves. Both operate based on automatic patterns. Both interpret each other's behavior in a limited way, and both reinforce a dynamic that neither fully understands. This is the most common scenario, and that's why so many relationships seem confusing, intense, and difficult to sustain. Now there's a point that completely changes how we deal with this. Recognizing the shadow doesn't mean eliminating problems. It means seeing more clearly. It means understanding why you are attracted to certain people, why you tolerate certain behaviors, and why you react in certain ways. And from that, create space for different choices. But this requires something that many people avoid: responsibility, not in the sense of guilt, but in the sense of participation. You don't control everything that happens in a relationship, but you actively participate in the dynamics that form. And when you recognize that, you stop being just someone who reacts and start being someone who chooses. Now there is one last reflection that needs to be made. What if many of the relationships you've had weren't just random encounters, but direct reflections of parts of themselves that have not yet been understood? If that's true, then the solution isn't just about finding different people. It's about understanding oneself more deeply. Because until that happens, the pattern tends to continue, and with it the same conflicts, the same imbalances, and the same unanswered questions. And it is precisely here that a crucial point arises. The moment you begin to realize that understanding these dynamics changes not only your relationships, but also how you position yourself within them. There's a specific point where the way you view your relationships changes irreversibly. It's not something dramatic on the outside. Nobody notices it immediately. But internally, the structure changes. What once seemed natural begins to be questioned. What you once accepted without thinking starts to cause discomfort. And most importantly, you begin to realize that you can no longer go back to the previous state. This moment doesn't happen suddenly. It builds up gradually through small perceptions. A behavior that once seemed normal begins to seem disproportionate. An absence that was once ignored starts to bother you. An effort that was once automatic begins to feel excessive. And these small perceptions, when they accumulate, create something bigger. They create awareness. And awareness changes everything. Because while you don't see, you adapt. You adjust your behavior to keep the relationship working. You justify your actions, interpret signals positively, and avoid conflicts that could destabilize the connection. But when you start to see clearly, these strategies stop working. You can no longer ignore the imbalance. You can no longer pretend you don't notice. And this creates an internal conflict. On one hand, there's habit, the desire to maintain what's already known, the comfort of continuing as things are. On the other hand, there's the realization that this isn't sustainable, that something needs to change. This conflict is silent but intense, because it's not just about the relationship. It's about how you position yourself in the world. Now think of something straightforward. How many times have you realized you were giving more than you were receiving, but decided to continue anyway? How many times have you understood that a dynamic wasn't balanced but chose to maintain it for fear of losing? How many times have you ignored your feelings in order to preserve a connection? These decisions are not random. They are part of a pattern. And awareness is the first step in breaking this pattern. But here's the point that few people talk about. Being aware doesn't make the process any easier. It makes it impossible to ignore. Before, you could say you didn't know. Now you know. And knowing requires taking a stand. You begin to realize the value of what you offer. Time, attention, presence, emotional energy. Things that once seemed simple start to be seen as limited resources. And when you understand this, you begin to question where you are investing. This questioning changes your behavior. You stop responding automatically. You start observing, evaluating, noticing patterns before acting, and this changes the dynamics of relationships. Some people notice this change. They sense that something is different, that you're no longer reacting the same way, that you're no longer available with the same intensity, and that generates a reaction. Some try to get closer. Others walk away. Others question this. And it is at this moment that many truths come to light. Relationships that depended on constant effort begin to weaken. Relationships based on balanced exchange adjust naturally. Relationships sustained solely by habit begin to lose their meaning, and this can create an unexpected feeling, an emptiness, not because you became alone, but because you stopped maintaining unbalanced connections. This space that opens up can be uncomfortable because you haven't yet built something new to fill that place. But this emptiness has a purpose. It creates space for choice. Before, you filled your relationships automatically. Now, you're selective, and selection requires discernment. Now, an important question arises. Are you choosing your relationships or just maintaining the ones you already have? Because there is a clear difference between continuing and choosing. Continuing requires little. Choosing requires awareness. Another thing that changes with clarity is how you deal with discomfort. Before, any sign of distance could generate anxiety. Now you observe, you analyze. Not all distance means loss. Not all absence needs to be compensated for. This reduces the urgency, and when the urgency decreases, the quality of your decisions increases. But this also brings a challenge. You begin to realize that not all relationships will keep pace with this level of awareness. Some people prefer to maintain automatic patterns. Others aren't interested in questioning the dynamics. And when you change, you stop fitting into those contexts. This can lead to estrangement, and separation generates emotional impact. Because even if the relationship wasn't balanced, it still represented something. Presence, routine, familiarity, and giving that up isn't easy. Now there is a crucial point. You need to choose between keeping something that is familiar or building something that is consistent with what you understand now. This choice doesn't happen just once. It repeats itself in every relationship, in every interaction, in every decision. And over time, these choices begin to form a new pattern. A pattern where you don't accept any dynamics. A pattern to which you don't automatically adapt. A pattern where you understand what you are offering and observe what you are receiving. This doesn't mean that everything becomes balanced immediately, but it means you stop supporting what clearly doesn't work. Now there is one final aspect that needs to be understood. Consciousness does not eliminate emotion. You still feel attached. You still feel the urge to maintain certain connections. You still find it difficult to let go. The difference is that now you realize when these emotions are not aligned with reality, and that requires maturity, because you need to act based on what is real, not just on what you feel. Now think clearly. How many relationships would you maintain today if you only considered balance, reciprocity, and consistency? And how many do you keep out of habit, fear, or attachment? This answer reveals much more than it seems, because it shows how stuck you still are in the old pattern. And how much have you already started to build something different? This process is not quick, it's not comfortable, but it's inevitable for those who begin to see. Because once you understand how the dynamics work, you can no longer ignore it. And this leads to a final point that needs to be addressed. Seeing changes your relationships, but most importantly, it changes you. There comes a point in life when you realize you can no longer go back to being who you were before. Not because everything has changed around you, but because something has changed inside you. You begin to see more clearly, and this clarity cannot be undone. It settles in, reorganizes your perception, and alters how you relate to everything, especially to people. For a long time, you may have believed that your relationships were guided solely by feelings, that it was enough to like someone, to care, to be present, but now you understand that there is a structure behind it. There is exchange, there is value, there is balance or imbalance. And above all, there is your active participation in all of this. This realization is liberating, but it also demands something that many people avoid: responsibility. Because from the moment you understand how the dynamics work, you can no longer act automatically. You can no longer surrender without observing. You can no longer insist without questioning. You can no longer accept without evaluating. And this completely changes the way you experience relationships. Now you begin to observe before acting. You start to notice patterns. You begin to identify when you are giving more than you receive. And for the first time, you understand that continuing to do this is not just an emotional choice, it's a conscious decision. And every decision has a consequence. Therefore, the first practical step you need to take is simple, but it requires honesty. Observe your relationships without justifying what is wrong. Ask yourself clearly, is this relationship balanced or does it just seem comfortable? Is there real exchange or just habit? Is there reciprocity or just adaptation on your part? These questions are not meant to generate guilt. They are meant to generate clarity. The second step is recognizing the value of what you offer. Your time is limited, your attention is focused, your emotional energy has a cost. When you begin to see this, you naturally become more selective. Not because you want to distance yourself from people, but because you understand that you can't distribute yourself haphazardly. The third step is to adjust your giving. It's not about stopping giving altogether, it's about stopping giving indiscriminately. Observe how people respond when you reduce the excess. Some will get closer, others will distance themselves, others simply won't notice. And that reveals much more than any conversation. The fourth step is accepting the impact of these changes. Some relationships will not continue, not because you did something wrong, but because they depended on your previous version to exist. And when you change, the dynamic stops working. This can create a feeling of loss. It can bring silence, distance, even doubt. But this space that opens up is not empty and meaningless. It is space for reconstruction. And here comes the fifth movement, developing awareness of what you truly seek. Do you want genuine presence or just occasional companionship? Do you want reciprocity or only attention when it's convenient for the other person? Do you want consistency or will you accept instability disguised as intensity? When you answer this clearly, your choices change. The sixth step is to create clear criteria, not based solely on what you feel, but on what you observe. Is the person consistent? Do they respect your time? Do they demonstrate genuine interest or only react when it's convenient? These questions bring objectivity to something that was previously purely emotional, and that protects you. Now, there is one point that defines all of this. You need to be willing to let go of what is not aligned, because while you try to maintain everything, you don't create space for something better. You remain stuck in the old pattern, even knowing that it doesn't work, and this generates a constant internal conflict. Now think about it honestly. How many times have you realized that something didn't make sense but continued anyway? How many times have you realized you were giving more than you were receiving, but chose to ignore it? How many times have you stayed in a relationship simply because it was easier than facing change? These decisions shape your life more than you realize. Because it's not just about the relationship itself, it's about the pattern you accept to repeat. And when you change that pattern, everything around you starts to reorganize itself. You start to feel lighter. Not because everything gets resolved, but because you stop carrying what isn't yours. You start to feel clearer, not because the answers appear easily, but because you stop deceiving yourself, and that transforms the way you live. Now there is one last thought that you need to take with you. You don't control who enters your life, but you do control who stays. And this decision needs to be based on conscience, not on habit, not on fear, not on need. Because the moment you make a clear choice, you completely change the quality of your relationships. And that changes your life. If this content resonated with you, if at any point you recognized yourself in these situations, that's already a sign that you're ready to see more. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring this type of content. Like the video so that more people can access this reflection, and share your questions or experiences in the comments. If you prefer, you can do this anonymously. Sometimes, recognizing a pattern is the first step towards transforming it.